just have to keep pushing buttons. So I was thinking of continuing the conversation about how language might influence various social movements, including the idea of equality. It just strikes me that English is the only language I know of where things are merely things, as opposed to either masculine or feminine. And all the other languages, even if they do have some things that are neuter, like German or Russian, are masculine and feminine as well. And those, at least in studies, definitely make for psychological attachments to masculine and feminine characteristics. So in the minds of the people that speak those languages, they think of those things, even though they are neuter in English, as masculine or feminine, and having masculine and feminine characteristics. And that strikes me as imposing that separation between masculine and feminine in a way that's harder to break out of in other languages, other cultures, than in English. And I think that would lead people to be just absolutely puzzled by you in thinking that way. And whereas with English, we're much more free to dispense with that kind of requirement imposed by our language. And we think of, how many different genders do we even suppose there might be sexually? Judith Butler, I think, has like 50 different genders, between, of course, heterosexual, male and female, and all the other in-betweens, which just are absolutely puzzling. Slavoj Žižek praises her for arguing that, well, we refer to LGB, help me, lesbian, help, I'm stuck. LG, right? What's the G stand for? Plus, yeah, so adding the plus, kind of, there's all those other ones out there. We don't want to insult anyone, and we don't. But it's also kind of a new phenomenon to think of things that way. However, even though I studied languages and I was a translator for my first career, that doesn't make me a linguist or a linguistician, so there's I'm sure you could study characteristics of languages and know a lot more about what might happen there. But I did mention Pierre Bourdieu, who I've read lots of his things, and one of his books was on the masculine. I forget what the French title is, but I've seen it as masculine domination in English, and that was an interesting book in that regard. Also, Douglas Hofstadter, in his book, Surfaces and Essences, talks about how that characteristic of language works in lots of different languages. So it's kind of interesting. Okay, so today, the first person of our discussion is Hannah Arendt, or Arendt. I've heard it pronounced both ways, but I'm not sure how it goes. It's interesting that her married name, have I mentioned her before? I mentioned this, Blücher is her married name. When I say Frau Blücher, do you have any immediate thoughts? No? today. Today's April 11th already. But if you look up Frau Blücher, this is from the movie Young Frankenstein.
Hi.
Have I showed you this before?
I am Frau Blücher.
Inga, may I present Frau Blücher? After you, Frau Blücher. Blücher! Good night, Frau Blücher. A toast. A toast to Blücher! Cigars.
So that's just weird. There's actually a question I have about that. That movie is made by Mel Brooks, right? If you're familiar, Mel Brooks made lots of spoofs on various genres, and that's the spoof he made on scary movies or horror movies, right? So it's a comedy all the way through, but it has lots of elements that we might refer to, by the way, as postmodern. Because in a sense, what he's doing, you have to be aware of the movies that he's making fun of in order to really appreciate the jokes in that movie. Because it's one thing after another that's playing on your awareness of older movies in the genre that he's making fun of, right? And in a sense, that's a characteristic of postmodernism that we haven't really talked much about. But Mel Brooks made other movies like Spaceballs, if you're familiar with that, yes? That made fun of all the, like the Star Wars movies, and very specifically the Star Wars movie. Dark Helmet is obviously supposed to be a spoof on Darth Vader, and so on. But then he also made Blazing Saddles, which I don't know if you're familiar with Blazing Saddles. And here's something. Shoot, where am I here?
He was then the goddess of desire, set men on fire. I have this power. Morning, noon, and night, it's swing and dancing, some quick romancing, and then a shower. Stage door Johnnies constantly surround me.
In case
They
you're
always
this is
hound
funny.
me with one request. Who can satisfy their lustful habits? I'm not a rabbit. I need some rest. I'm tired, sick and tired of love. I've had my fill of love. and above. Tired, tired of being admired, tired of love uninspired. Let's face it, I'm tired. I've been with thousands of men again and again. They promised the moon. They're all.
So this is rats. I'm not having any luck here.
Dinner. Another bad looking.
Not the professor of magic.
Sì, hai un po' di cavolovazione, penso che sbagliate questi schermi. Why did you call me? And I didn't tell you all I'm not.
I'm trying to find the spot. So the song in Blazing Saddles is making fun of this movie. In this particular
I'll tell you a secret. Don't hammer on the keys. Break the keys.
trying to find where she comes out. Shoot. Well, let me just. This is a movie that the basic plot is that the professor of the local high school finds his students, and he's very strict, etc. Typical German school of the time, and he finds his students carrying
How do you let me know?
advertisements for this burlesque show in the local bar, and he's going to catch them in the act. So he goes to the show, and he's planning, of course, on just catching his students and, punishing them for showing up at such a thing. Trouble is, he's treated with a great deal of respect as he arrives himself at the show, and he ends up falling in love with the main character, and of course that totally destroys his career, and he ends up becoming the clown in the the movie's The Blue Angel, or Der Blaue Engel. His name is Professor Unruh, which means no peace.
Not the professor of magic.
So it's obviously, but so the character that the singer in Blazing Saddles is making fun of is her in her scene. And I wish I could have found it, because as kind of hilarious as Gene Wilder's wife, Madeline Kahn, makes that song in Blazing Saddles. When you hear the main singer from the German tradition that does that, it's like she's imitating her precisely. So it's absolutely hilarious.
How dare you? I came here to thank my brothers. Ich komme hier wegen meiner Schüler. Meine Schüler.
By the way, it turns out, of course, that the clown that they have at the time that the professor goes to the show, he used to love her too. So it's like every guy that gets attached to her ends up becoming the clown in the show. So it's kind of a sad thing. But I'll quit looking for it there. It's just, by the way, there's an English version of it too you could find. And here's Madeline. Let's see, what is this? Maybe this is just a...
It's been 63 years since the plump and sassy star of Josef von Sternberg's The Blue Angel traveled from Berlin to Hollywood and began molding herself into Dietrich, the legend, who could make love to half the...
So, there you go. That's just fun. So Mel Brooks makes fun of all these different genres and all these different movies. But he's also a member of the Jewish community, especially in Hollywood. And why did they pick the name Frau Blücher to have that ongoing little snippet of the horses reacting oddly? There's no explanation why that would be, etc. You just have to use your imagination. Obviously, even Frau Blücher herself in the movie is rather perturbed by the horse's behavior, etc. But there are lots of silly things in the movie. It's just a constant barrage, really, of silliness. But in any case, why would Mel Brooks might have it out to make fun of Frau Blücher? And if we look at Hannah Arendt's grave, and the reason she's Frau Blücher is because her husband that she married, who was a fellow student of a friend of hers in Germany when they were in graduate school, I believe. Notice his name was Blücher, and they both taught at Baird College in upstate New York, which is kind of an odd thing. I don't know very many universities or colleges that have a cemetery on the campus, and that's pretty weird. And so professors that die there end up being buried there. That's kind of weird. But so both of them were professors at Baird College, and notice the grave is right there off the path. You could like walk by on your way to science class and you could see their grave. That strikes me as pretty weird too. But so why on earth might Mel Brooks have made fun of Frau Blücher? Well, Hannah Arendt's most famous act, and by the way, the quiz question I'll ask for you today is, what did Hannah Arendt mean by the banality of evil? What did she mean by the banality of evil? If you look it up, you'll see it's famous. It's a famous line. But she was an American reporter. Now, obviously, she's a German student, German Jewish student, by the way, and a student of Martin Heidegger. In fact, I believe she's just about one of the most famous students of Martin Heidegger. He had some others. Habermas, for example, was one of his students. But in any case, she left France because of the Nazis taking over France, and she headed for the United States with her husband, and ended up teaching eventually. But she was a reporter first, and ended up being a reporter in Jerusalem during the trial of Adolf Eichmann. And Adolf Eichmann was the individual that was considered responsible for running the Holocaust. So he was the bureaucrat that organized the trains and the camps and the supplies and the shipment of all of the people and everything. So when they finally found him in South America and brought him to Jerusalem and put him on trial, it was a big event, and Hannah Arendt was there as one of the American press and wrote. In fact, she ended up writing a book about the trial. And her phrase, the banality of evil. And it totally irritated, I think, the Jewish community. They were furious about her summation of his character. In any case, more recently, there have been things published about her. One of the interesting things is the publication of letters between Hannah Arendt and Martin Heidegger. Martin Heidegger was about 20 years older than her, and she was his graduate student in Freiburg University. And they fell in love and had an affair, and the affair never ended, actually. In fact, it's kind of an odd thing. Mrs. Heidegger knew about the affair, and there are pictures of them getting together in a hotel in Germany many years later, after World War II, after he had been punished for his relationship with the Nazis. He was, for a year and a half or so, he was the head of Freiburg University as a member of the Third Reich, and fired some of the Jewish professors that worked there, and famously said that while the Wehrmacht, the army, was the first arm of the Reich, and the Luftwaffe, the Air Force, was the second arm of the Reich, the academic community was the third arm of the Reich. So that's kind of interesting. So very clear that he was a Nazi, at least for a while. It's kind of questionable what his philosophy had to do with the Nazi Third Reich, etc. But notice he's also in love with a Jewish graduate student. So that's of course kind of interesting. And Mrs. Heidegger knew about it, and the only thing she didn't like about Hannah was that she smoked too much. So that's kind of weird too. But so we have the love letters and everything, and that's pretty interesting. So we have that. But also, recently, let me just pick up Hannah this time. Let's see if it comes right up. Let's go this this way. So here's one magazine article, The Urgent Relevance of Hannah Arendt, which is from August 2018. But there's another one that I read just the other day. Shoot, it didn't come up this time. But there was an interesting article about why Hannah Arendt is the philosopher of today, or the philosopher that we should especially be reading today. And part of it was her work on totalitarianism. And so, of course, what they're trying to do is refer to her as significant and someone we should reread today because of the political situation in our own country with President Trump in the way he maneuvers politically as president to try to accomplish what he wants to do, but not just what he does, who he appoints. And so one of the latest things, for example, is the Attorney General has announced yesterday that he is suspicious of the FBI as literally trying to spy on Trump's campaign during the primaries and the actual election, which makes it look like the FBI is guilty of crimes, and he wants the Department of Justice to investigate the FBI's actions during that campaign. So that's kind of interesting. Instead of the Mueller report basically finding things happened in Trump's campaign that would make them guilty of collusion with foreign countries, it turns out that the Attorney General that he's appointed to the Department of Justice is finding that the Democrats were guilty of collusion, et cetera. So a lot of people are concerned that this looks more like fascism, than, so, boy, if this keeps up, eventually it's going to be like Hitler and, his various staff picks, which all supported him and imposed a fascist, totalitarian form of government. And the argument, too, goes that that President Trump is just an example of this general trend, that it's not just our own country that seems to be moving towards a totalitarian or fascist approach to governance, but that we see this in Europe as well. Hungary, for example, was one country that's recently moved in that direction. There's gains on the conservative parties in Europe that all have that they're all interpreted as having that tendency to be fascist. And of course, Putin is considered in Russia to be the prime example of this tendency and basically deliberately spreading that. So if there is collusion there, or if you look at it's very clear that the Russians did have an interest in Trump winning over Hillary because they liked Trump's positions and they didn't trust Hillary. That in a sense their attempt to disrupt democracies leads those democracies towards the same kind of governance that Putin has in Russia. And another example of this, in fact, Slavoj Žižek refers to him as the founder of this modern totalitarian movement is Lee Kuan Yew, he's dead now, although his son is has replaced him, as far as I know. But so in Singapore, over the years, after World War II, Lee Kuan Yew was the strong man, the one that basically enforced modern life on Singapore. And he's a hero because of his success in doing that. But what's important here, of course, is the style of governance he used. It is not a democracy. It's instead in a sense, a tyrant, but he's a benevolent tyrant. I mean, his goals are good. His methods basically achieve modern living conditions in a densely packed city. So he's like the hero in Asia, the role model that a lot of governors are using as how they should govern. And so there's this interesting movement that's suggesting that democracy is not the future, but instead a government more like this, a totalitarian form of government. Not totalitarian in the sense of communist, the Soviet Union of the Soviet Socialist Republics, what used to be what Russia was up until 1989, or 90 rather. And notice even communist China isn't, strictly speaking, never really officially was a communist country. It's actually always been China. And China always did things its own unique way, all the way back from Confucian times. So it's kind of interesting to look at that. If you're interested, Henry Kissinger has a terrific book out called China, which explains that. But there are lots of others that describe China. Francis Fukuyama, for example, explains China as one form of government that goes way back thousands of years ago, etc., as another possibility to democracy. So that's kind of interesting. So reading Hannah Arendt is politically interesting again, and that, of course, makes her rather important for lots of reasons. So Hannah Arendt. The newest book that's out are her essays in understanding from 1953 to 1975, and it's titled Thinking Without a Banister. Banister, railing, in other words, thinking outside of the box, etc., basically. So it's kind of interesting if you're curious. I haven't checked yet to see if our library has a copy of that. That's a new one. So Hannah Arendt. My other example for today is Roger Scruton, who I've mentioned before.
An epic new documentary that explores a special bond between humans.
I think one of the saddest things about the modern world, partly a result of television, is that people live in a tiny time slice of the present moment, which they can carry forward with them, but nothing remains. And there's nothing in their experience which reverberates down the centuries, because the centuries to them are completely dark. Just unilluminated corridors.